Took me a while, but I'm back with another tale of some cold boys going somewhere desolate, having a terrible time, and many ending up dead. Because, while the tales of explorers don't often repeat, they do rhyme and repeat. Especially if you're one of the many people who claim to be the first person to reach the North Pole. To recap that list, we have Cook and Peary, who might have made it. Henson, who was with Peary and might have been ahead of him. Byrd, who flew and probably missed it. Amundsen, who flew and definitely found it. Ralph Plaisted, he made the first definite ground conquest of the pole in a snowmobile. And Sir Wally Herbert and his team, who were the first to definitely make it on foot. Where was I? Oh yes, these stories rhyme. A lot. This is the Jeannette Expedition, and it's basically America's much smaller scale answer to the Franklin Expedition. As in, it had fewer ships, fewer men, and more people survived. This was 1879 and was led by Lieutenant Commander George DeLong, who'd got the polar bug while serving on the USS Juanita, one of the rescue ships searching near Greenland for the Polaris Expedition of 1873. I should probably do a video about that sometime. DeLong planned to go for the North Pole, and because he wasn't listed earlier, you already know this won't go well for him. DeLong found a backer in moustache enthusiast James Gordon Bennett Jr., who was a newspaper magnate and was out for a new popular exploration stunt. He'd recently made huge waves by paying Henry Morton Stanley to trudge around Africa, looking for someone who could say, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," to. Luckily, he did in fact find a Dr. Livingston.
Dr. Livingston, I presume?
Yes, Sam Livingston, Jungle Doctor.
And in case you're British, my commiserations, but you know some of us have to be. Yes, this is the Gordon Bennett, where the phrase Gordon Bennett comes from. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a slightly old-timey, working-class English exclamation.
Everybody is dead, Dave.
Not Chen.
Gordon Bennett, yes, Chen, everybody. Everybody's dead, Dave.
So upon hearing this fact, you can, in fact, exclaim, "Gordon Bennett!" in surprise, and it make perfect sense. Now, because polar explorers rarely learn anything except by pain and death, the plan was to assume that there was an open polar sea just beyond all the ice up there. So the ship they sourced, the English proto-icebreaker, the Pandora, was chosen for its toughness. They aimed to get through the ice until they found plain sailing. Franklin had apparently attempted this in 1845, before giving up and going into the narrow iceways of the passage. So why did people think there was an open ocean on the roof of the world? It's kinda complicated, but a lot of people were involved in this over a long period of time. For instance, here's an early 1600s map by Mercator, one of the most important map makers in history, showing it. You might not know his name, but you've seen Mercator's work. You see this? This is his world map. It is impossible to flatten a globe down into a map without cuts or distortion. And that's his distortion, the Mercator projection. And as we all know, it is kind of hard to dislodge a wrong idea when it's been given some sort of authority, such as a big-ass map by Mercator. And it's not the only time this sort of thing has happened. The mountains of Kong and California as an island stayed around much longer than they should have because they were on maps. One of the ideas was that the various streams, like the Gulf Stream, kept the water warm enough that it wouldn't freeze. Just beyond all the ice, that it apparently couldn't warm up enough to not freeze. Another was that it simply didn't freeze, for reasons. Another idea was that it had to be clear water beyond the ice, because that's what the ancients believed. Another was that there was a great iron mountain at the pole, which would explain magnetism, and all the magnetism was somehow melting the ice. And it didn't help that polar explorers sometimes claimed to have seen the open polar sea for themselves. The big proponent for the open polar sea at the time of the Jeannette Expedition was August Petermann, a German map maker who had detailed theories about how the open polar sea worked, but never went north himself to check if it was real. It kinda reminds me, honestly, of Karl May, the German author of autobiographical adventure stories set in the Americas and Africa, who never left Germany. Ships would sometimes follow the path of the Gulf Stream, trying to find a weak spot in the ice that led to the open polar sea, but eventually even Petermann realized that no one had found the open polar sea that way, so instead decided that the way to it must be by following another stream, the Kuro Seawow through the Bering Strait, which is what the Jeannette Expedition would try to do. You see, Bennett was big into polar exploration and had personally consulted with Petermann, who even provided detailed maps of the area, which were all based in his imagination and theories, because This is the 1870s high Arctic, and most of this stuff has still not been mapped. Anyway, Peterman killed himself around the same time the expedition left, which really showed stunning confidence in his ideas. Now, the Pandora was renamed the Jeannette by Bennett. Jeannette Bennett was his sister. This really annoyed the crew. It was bad enough they were on a ship called the Pandora, an ill omen because of the whole box thing, but they renamed it. Apparently, it is terrible luck to rename a ship. Just ask the crew of the Amazon. Oh, wait, you can't. They renamed it the Mary Celeste. Anyway, the Jeannette was crewed, and the crew was mixed. Not in a 19th century way, in a sitcom kind of way. On the one hand was George Melville, one of the great naval engineers of the 19th century. He was a distant relative of author Herman Melville of whale fame. On the other hand, the navigator was John W. Danenhauer, who had spent some time in an insane asylum and had worsening syphilis that was slowly destroying his eyes. He had to have eye surgery in the bowels of the ship without anesthetic, and was eventually in such bad shape that he couldn't bear to look anything bright. Luckily, the Arctic isn't glaringly bright white or anything. Eventually, he took to constantly wearing dark goggles, just so he could technically do his job, which I would remind you is navigator. Later on, when the real fun began, he would spend a lot of time complaining about not being put in command of any men, in between falling into crevasses. There was also Jerome Collins, an OG Irish Republican, chief scientist of the expedition, who spent most of his time irritating everyone else with puns and bad jokes and being the target of 19th century anti-Catholic bigotry. Interestingly, while he was technically a meteorologist, he was mostly a journalist. Now, that wasn't the whole crew, it's not quite that small, there were 32 of them, but I'm only planning on doing 2 videos on this, so we're skipping ahead a bit. The Jeannette left Europe and headed for San Francisco. 6 months and 0 stops later, they arrived with very little coal left, and final arrangements were made. A young Thomas Edison provided crank-powered arc lights and a basic motor to run them, if no one was free to tire their arms out. Alexander Graham Bell provided a rudimentary telephone system. The idea was to keep in contact with teams on the ice and have easy communications on board. None of these worked. One thing that DeLong considered getting but didn't was a hot air balloon. Not to fly to the pole like S.A. Andre, but as a way to get a further view of the area. And I have to admit, it is kind of ingenious. Tie it to the ship and you can see for miles. Perfect for spotting any leads in the ice or any magical open polar seas out there. In summer 1879, a year after leaving Europe, they headed north with many tons of coal and canned food, but also pemmican, Native American survival food, a mixture of jerky, fat, and berries. Full of energy and lasts for ages. I'd love to try it sometime. Anyway, in Alaska, they stopped to pick up 2 Inuit dog drivers and 40 dogs. So they headed north, and then through the Bering Strait, and north again, until all they met was ice. No sign of a gateway through the ice to the open polar sea. No sign of ice weak enough to be broken through to the open polar sea. No open polar sea. A balloon really would have been useful. My guess they didn't bring it was because of cost or space. The Jeannette kept doing their best to go northwest through the Cookchee Sea until they were surrounded by the ice in September. They settled down for a long wait. They spent 15 months in the pack, mostly continuing northwest, eventually ending up north of Russia. Now, icebound ships rarely freeze perfectly horizontally, and the Jeannette was no exception. The crew had to walk at an angle. At one point during the polar night, there was a leak in the bowels of the ship, and Melville, a real Scotty type, used some empty food cans and a windmill to jury-rig a pump to clear the water and repair the hole. And because the electric lights weren't working, some of this had to be done in darkness. The expedition doctor, Ambler, set up a distillery on board during the cold months. It was to make fresh water from ice or ocean water, basically very small-scale desalinization, and oversaw exercise, even sports on the ice. At one point, one of the dogs was heard howling in agony on the ice. It had fallen asleep and its body heat had melted the ice. When it awoke, its hind legs were encased in refrozen ice, and it had to be shot. Now, apart from the occasional horrors, life on the ice was actually fairly easy. There's not much to do on a ship that's icebound except keep things running, and listen to the ice, because you might think that an ice field is quiet, but it's not. The ice is constantly moving, crushing into itself, raising, lowering, impacting the ship. I found this audio from a ship in pack ice. Imagine this for 15 months. Each sound could be the beginning of your ship's destruction.
This man is about to die.
And that is as good a place to leave it as any. Next time we'll find out who'll survive and what will be left of them. If you enjoyed this and you like my stuff, please give me a like, a sub, ring the bell, and leave a comment. I do read them all, and the surrealer the better. And if you're able, then please consider checking out the Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel, and a fantastic way to ensure that I can continue to make videos.